Soldier Mage King, Chapter 22. Le Morte d'Arthur. Arthur remembered going up against the questing beast. Remembered Merlin screaming his name as the thing threw him across the cave. The next thing he remembered, he was in his room. He blinked blearily. Looking down, he saw bandages across his chest and upper right shoulder. His father was asleep on a chair next to his bed, his front atop Arthur's blankets. Arthur cleared his throat and coughed. Uther shot upright. "Arthur!" he gasped in joy. "Guards!" Two men burst into the room. "Fetch Gaius at once. Tell him Arthur's awake." The explanation came out quickly. Arthur had been felled by the questing beast. Gaius had sent Merlin for a cure that could only be found outside of Camelot, and it had worked. He would be unable to use his right arm for some time yet, but he would live. The night after he woke, someone entered his room without knocking. Without even looking up, he knew it to be Merlin. Even after near a full year in Camelot, she had not yet learned the subtle art of knocking. He dreamed of her when he was asleep from his wound. Not that he'd ever say it aloud. He dreamed she was on a boat, floating through a mist, looking as though she were a fae emerging from a story his nurse had told him when he was a child. "How are you?" Merlin asked. "Good, I think. I'll be glad to get out of this sling," Arthur said, trying to pour himself a glass of wine. Merlin's hands wrapped around his single one and guided the pitcher, taking it from him when the glass was full. "I'm glad. I need to talk to you," she said, setting down the pitcher. Arthur raised an eyebrow. She seemed so serious, uncharacteristically so. "Thought as prince, I decided when we talked," he joked, attempting to lighten the mood. "Not tonight," Merlin said, shaking her head. "Sometimes I wonder if after all this time you still haven't worked out who I am," Arthur said, trying to get her to smile. It worked, but only just. "I know exactly who you are, Arthur. You're a prat," she said. He made a noise of protest, but she kept talking. "A royal one, but still a prat." That almost made him laugh, reminding him of their second meeting when he'd teased her in the marketplace. He'd followed her when she'd refused to speak to him, like a petulant child, until he'd been tripped by a stray rope. By the time he'd managed to rise, she had vanished. "Are you ever going to change, Merlin?" he asked, unable to hide the affection in his tone. "You'd get bored if I did," she said, grinning, but her tone sounded strange. "But if you do get another servant, don't get a bootlicker. Promise me that." That made Arthur turn to look at her. Her eyes were shining with what could only be unshed tears. He rose on slightly shaky legs, stepping over to her. "What's wrong, Merlin? You're acting strange," he said, and she shook her head, turning her back on him and subtly trying to rid her face of any trace of tears. "If this is you trying to quit..." "No," she said, turning back to him, her eyes only marginally drier. "I'm happy to serve you until the day I die, Arthur." Something about the way she said it made him reach out with his good hand and take hers. "Something's wrong. You're not usually this proper," he said, frowning. She shook her head. "Nothing's wrong, Arthur. In fact, I just wanted to say that someday you're going to be an excellent king, but you must learn to listen to others," she said, her words turning cryptic once more. He was listening now, and he didn't quite like what he heard. It sounded as if she was saying goodbye. "Merlin, if something's happened, if someone's threatening you, you need to tell me. I can't help if you don't tell me what's happening." Normally, he wouldn't admit that he wished to help, but she was acting so strange. She was starting to scare him. "Like I said, nothing's wrong. Just don't be a prat," she managed, and pulled herself out of his grip. She was gone before he could take another step. Arthur wobbled his way over to the door and motioned one of the guards over to him. "Find Sir Leon. Tell him to keep an eye on Merlin. Something's off," he ordered, and the guard nodded, taking off at a sprint. Arthur flopped back down into his chair, wishing he could have gone after her himself, but he feared he wouldn't have made it halfway down the stairs. The illness that had come with his injury had sapped him of most of his strength. Not even an hour later, Leon arrived in his room. Arthur had been unable to sleep. He would liked to have paced around his room, waiting for word, but he could not, so Instead, he sat, staring into his undrunk wine. "Sire," Leon called, closing the door behind him. "You're meant to be keeping an eye on Merlin," Arthur said, frowning. "She's gone, sire. Rode out of Camelot as if the hounds of hell were on her heels barely 10 minutes ago. I couldn't have kept up with her if I wanted. She didn't even stop to saddle her horse, sire," Leon said, and Arthur looked up at him, confused. "Why?" "I don't know. But I do know her mother is here in Camelot, and gravely ill. Gwen is watching her," Leon said, still standing by the door. Arthur nodded to one of the chairs in the room. Leon sat down gratefully. "Why is Gwen treating Merlin's mother?" Arthur asked. Leon frowned. "She said Gaius went to fetch something, but that Merlin took off after him shortly after she returned from speaking to you. Gaius appears to have taken a horse as well, though he actually stopped to saddle the damn thing," Leon said, frowning. "Sire, what do you think is happening?" "I don't know. My father told me Merlin was sent to get the cure that healed me, but I am beginning to wonder if there was some price for that cure that I do not know of. All I know about it is that it came from outside Camelot," Arthur said. "Gaius would never do anything to endanger Merlin. He's her uncle by blood and has acted as though he were her father since she arrived in Camelot," Leon assured. "It's not Gaius I'm worried about," Arthur said, frowning. "Perhaps Merlin remembered some cure or another that could save her mother. She is the only close family she has, from what I understand," Leon suggested. Arthur nodded. "Perhaps," he said, and nodded for Leon to leave. Something about this situation did not sit well with him. Pain became Merlin's whole world as she failed to deflect Nimueh's fireball. It was near overwhelming, but the sight of Gaius lying prone at the foot of the stone altar stirred something inside her, something wild and angry. She rose, unsure how she found the strength to do so. With her anger rose a storm above them, roiling and angry. Nimueh glanced up, then back at Merlin with trepidation for the first time. Merlin could feel the power in every part of her being, could feel the pulse of Nimueh's life and the dimming light that was Gaius where he lay. There was a feeling there. Nimueh had spoken of balance. This was what she meant. A life needed to be taken. "You should not have killed my friend." Merlin barely heard her own voice echo around her, as though she was speaking with 1,000 different voices. Calling the lightning was almost too easy, and in a flash of light, Nimueh was gone. Rain began to pour as Merlin ran to Gaius. She screamed in defiance as she felt his life slipping away. Then the light inside him grew suddenly brighter. He coughed and blinked. "Merlin?" he asked, and she smiled. "It's done. Nimueh is dead. Balance restored." Gaius stared at her. "You have no idea how amazing what you've done was, do you?" he muttered, and Merlin shrugged, helping him up. "Child, you held the power of life and death in your hands without an ounce of training on how to use it. You should have caused chaos to break through the world, but you managed to restore balance." He pulled her into a hug that she readily returned. To him, it seemed she still had no idea what she had done. Perhaps it was for the best. "Any chance you could stop this infernal rain?" he asked, and she laughed. They returned to Camelot at a much more sedate pace, if only to spare Merlin's poor horse. She'd nearly killed the poor thing catching up with Gaius. As they walked back to the physician's chambers, Merlin looked up and caught Arthur watching out his window. She smiled up at him, and could have sworn he returned the smile, looking nearly relieved. They managed to hide Merlin's injury quite well. With a bit of magic, it healed into a scar the size of Merlin's fist, sitting directly over her heart. Her mother recovered and stayed a full week before returning to Ealdor. Merlin smiled again, and Arthur seemed relieved that she was around for once. All told, things couldn't have been better.